now. But my dissertation research examines the relationship between martial masculinity and alcohol, specifically in the British Army of the early 19th century. I study the drinking habits of so-called gentlemen officers, as you'll see them referred to, who served in the Canadas. Guys like John Le Couture, William Tiger Dunlop, and John Richardson, some names you might be familiar with. Basically, I argue that alcohol consumption significantly influenced the way in which these men perceived themselves and others under their command. That manliness in this martial sphere was defined by an ability to drink and to drink well. However, gentlemen officers held that basically they alone had this requisite skill in inebriation, as they called it, to do so. Those who they perceived as their social and racial inferiors, on the other hand, were typically cast as completely unable to control their supposed baser impulses to drink and to drink to excess. This included soldiers from lower class backgrounds, Irish soldiers, and Indigenous allies of the British. Basically, by defining these groups as problematic inebriates in their writings and by restricting people's access to alcohol, we see that officers are really just constructing their own martial masculine identity, which is as civilized, strong, and superior. So I'm going to start with one of my famous quotes, one of my favorite famous quotes, I should say. It's from Sir Arthur Wellesley, aka the Duke of Wellington. Speaking of the army under his command during the Peninsular War, he famously remarked that it was composed of the scum of the earth, the mere scum of the earth, that British soldiers are fellows who have enlisted for drink. That is the plain fact. They have all enlisted for drink. This was a very common perception at the time. One of Wellington's fellow officers, Colonel David Roberts, expressed a similar view, and I love this quote as well. This characterization of soldiers is a melancholy truth. The immorality of the British soldier is disgusting, and it is only by strict attention and severe discipline it is at all kept within bounds. For the purpose of getting liquor, the invincible British soldier will commit every species of depredation. He will rob a house, plunder a church, steal from his comrade, and strip his own officer in the midst of death and slaughter. This was the popular perception of British soldiers in the Napoleonic era across the empire, from India to Upper Canada. But what I wanted to consider is how accurate are these representation of soldiers? Because this is the only word we get is from officers. And I argue that this was not very representative at all. In fact, I think these types of characterizations really tell us a lot more about officers themselves than they do about enlisted soldiers. I argue that this idea of the drunken soldier, a lot like the so-called drunken Indian, was a social and cultural construction held by those officers. It was not representative of the men who served under Wellington or the men who served in the War of 1812. Now, numerous historians of drink in the British Army, such as Martin Howard, Paul Copperman, they've portrayed the common soldier in this era as a habitual drunkard, or to use a more modern word, an alcoholic. Copperman in particular argues that throughout the 18th century in the British Army, and here's a quote, "Alcohol abuse was the rule, sobriety the exception." When we examine soldiers drinking in this period, though, we really need to consider our own historical bias. 19th century temperance and prohibition movements, and especially recent advances in our understanding of the science of alcohol, have significantly colored our modern perceptions. But prior to the 1820s in Britain and the Canadas, it was widely held that moderate consumption of alcohol was actually beneficial. In most cases, colonists consumed this as a normal part of daily life. In fact, 17th century New England clergyman, Increase Mather, he described alcohol as a good creature of God and to be received with thankfulness. The medical community did recognize that excessive consumption of distilled spirits could be potentially harmful to one's health in the 18th century, but wine and liquor were simultaneously prescribed by physicians to treat a number of ailments. The Scottish physician William Cullen advocated the use of spirits to treat all manner of illnesses, from fevers to gout, even broken legs. And Thomas Trotter, oh, my mistake, a naval physician, argued that the consumption of strong spirits provided the body with actual protection against the rigors of foreign climates, especially hot and cold. Furthermore, whereas we typically consider alcohol today to be an inherently addictive substance, in the 18th and 19th century, the blame was typically placed on the drinker for his compulsion rather than the drink itself. It was thought that a man's own weakness, immorality, or depravity led him to drink to excess. And this was actually doubly the case with women, rather than any sort of physical addiction to a particular substance. So characterizations that alcohol abuse was the rule, as Copperman quotes, they're simply inaccurate. They're as inaccurate as characterizations that common soldiers all enlisted for drink, in the words of Wellington. In reality, alcohol played a complex and multifaceted role in the lives of soldiers, and one that can only be understood if it's placed within the proper historical context. So it's also important to recognize that these negative characterizations of soldiers found in the source material, they're coming almost exclusively from officers. And because of this, they are heavily informed by class and power dynamics. Officers in this period were traditionally drawn from a much higher social class in civilian society as compared to common enlisted soldiers. And officers, they were generally members of the gentry and lower aristocracy. They viewed common soldiers as drawn, on the other hand, from the lower orders of society. So this class dynamic, which already existed, was even further reinforced within the military hierarchy. Common men enlisted at the lowest rank of private and were subordinate to all others, whereas men of greater means, on the other hand, were typically able to purchase a higher rank or commission, typically of ensign or lieutenant or higher up, which immediately elevated these men above privates or non-commissioned officers. I'll talk a little bit more about the ranks later, but the idea is that these commissioned officers' own conceptions of class and race, the way in which they constructed their own identity, all informed the way they perceived and especially the way they wrote about others. So this is something we need to consider when evaluating whether or not enlisted men were indeed drunken, as frequently reported by officers. So unlike officers, British common soldiers typically came from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, ranging from rural laborers to skilled artisans and tradesmen. But as mentioned, they were generally viewed by the social elite as one collective entity, that is the lower orders, what would later be called the Great Unwashed. Members of the social elite perceived all who occupied this lower order of society as particularly prone to excessive alcohol consumption. This perception stemmed in part from rampant gin consumption amongst the laboring poor in England during the 18th century gin craze. Lower class drunkenness became associated with crime and social disorder, and it seemingly posed a threat to public security, political stability, the economy, traditional gender roles, the structure of the family, but ultimately the health of the nation. All of this is depicted in William Hogarth's famous 1751 print Gin Lane, which I have there in front of you. Famously captures the scene on one street in London with in full grip of the so-called gin craze. And this print can tell us a lot about the fears of the upper classes with regards to lower class inebriety. The people in the image are starving, they're dirty, they're in various stages of madness. On the left there, you can see them pawning their wares, slipping further into poverty. Death and disease are rampant. In the center of an image, a mother neglects her child, letting it fall presumably to its death, hence the nickname for gin, which is mother's ruin. Other children can be seen in the background too, children drinking. Injured drunken men brawl around them. Even worse, especially for a Protestant population, no one in this picture is working. The streets and the buildings of Gin Lane are falling apart. So the nation is falling into disorder. Now, Members of the ruling elite held they alone possessed the requisite self-control to manage their drinking. They figured that members of the lower orders of society did not. Accordingly, they cast their perceived social inferiors as like children or simple beasts, basically creatures who are unable to exercise their will to control their baser impulses. And this suggests that, of course, these people are in need of the guidance of their social betters, right? So this effectively validates the ruling class's social standing. Now, soldiers who were thought to be drawn from this lower order of society were accordingly imbued with this same childish or brutish inability to control themselves. Consequently, officers across the empire came to view the common British soldier as, this is a quote, constitutionally predisposed to drink, based on his lower class origins. We also need to recognize that the general British public in this period already held a very low opinion of soldiers. Not only did they distrust standing armies as a potential threat to liberty, but they just generally saw soldiers as particularly brutish figures. As Janine Hurleyman has demonstrated, she's written a couple books on this topic. It was widely held in the 18th century that common soldiers in the British Army enlisted in the army in order to flee their wives, to flee their children, to flee their domestic responsibilities. It was assumed that they enlisted to engage in an adolescent bachelor culture, which was characterized by activities seen below, heavy drinking and especially womanizing. These were very antithetical to civilian domestic ideals of manliness. So as the army rapidly increased in size during this period, it gets even worse because recruiters look for basically any able-bodied man to enlist, regardless of social standing, and even sometimes regardless of past criminal history or other factors. Recruiters are frequently looking for men in taverns and even plying them with alcohol. If you've seen some tavern glasses from this period, they have a clear bottom in them, and the story is that recruiters would come in and unsuspectingly drop a king's shilling into a man's beer, and if he finished the beer, he was recruited because he had accepted the king's shilling. So you want to look through the bottom of your glass to see if that shilling's in there before you take a sip. But there is another concern as well. Officers also perceived most common enlisted soldiers to be particularly prone to drunkenness or inebriety based on their quote-unquote race. In this case, they point to their Irish background. During the Napoleonic era, roughly 1/3 of British soldiers were of Irish descent, and Englishmen generally viewed Irishmen as completely unable to control their supposedly inherent impulse to drink whiskey and to drink it to excess. Samuel Morwood, for example, a 19th century English collector of excise in Dublin, noted that the characteristic habits of these people was to drink, and that some are seldom sober during the whole year. This stereotype was tied to English characterizations that the Irish were lazy and unreliable and in need of England's paternal guidance. Big surprise. A characterization which completely validated English imperial rule over Ireland. Now, this remained a pervasive construct in 18th and early 19th century British and American culture. This is actually an American image here. And this significantly influenced how the Irish were viewed across the British Empire, including in the Canadas. Militia officer Eli Plater, an early Upper Canadian, for example, notes that on St. Patrick's Day in York in 1802, it occasioned a number of drunken Irishmen in town. So this is a phrase that's already being used in the early 19th century. Comments from the aforementioned Colonel Roberts, who I noted there at the outset, revealed that this stereotype was also well established within early 19th century British Army culture as well. He pokes fun at the perceived inebriety of the Irish in his satirical poem, The Military Adventures of Johnny Newcomb. And I very highly recommend this one. It's quite funny. But he does so with a particular character, Teague O'Connor. Teague is the protagonist Batman, which is not a masked hero, but more of a personal servant. And Teague is always trying to sneak a drink when possible. We've got a little section of the poem here. Poor Teague, esteemed by all, a hearty fellow, with parting glass had got a little mellow, a trifle failing, I must disclose. Teague swore 'twas for the honor of his nose, whose lovely size and color to his thinking could only be maintained by hearty drinking. Illustrations that accompany the poem, as this one here that I've selected, typically depict Teague's nose as large and red. In this period, the red or boil-ridden nose was the physical mark of a drunkard. So Roberts in his poem is playing upon this idea, having Teague humorously attempt to shift the blame from his drunkenness onto his nose, when Roberts' readership would have recognized that Teague's inebriety was somehow racially inevitable, and indeed the cause of his large nose. Now, many of the regiments stationed in the Canadas during the War of 1812 were indeed predominantly Irish. This wasn't just a perception. What was a perception was that they accordingly had a reputation for drinking and wild behavior. For example, the 49th Regiment of Foot, who Isaac Brock described as a wild Irish regiment, which had been 10 years in this country drinking rum without bounds. Or there was William Tiger Dunlop's 89th Regiment, who Dunlop affectionately referred to as a group of wild, tremendous Irishmen who rarely went to bed without a respectable quorum of them getting a little to the lee side of sobriety. There was also the newly raised 100th Regiment of Foot, which I have pictured here, which was recruited primarily in Northern Ireland and even given the title Prince Regent's County of Dublin Regiment. They were very officially an Irish regiment. Speaking of the 100th, Brock wrote that, being nearly all Irish, they of all others are the most volatile and easily led astray. Should they therefore hereafter be seduced by the various temptations by which they are surrounded, I hope to escape the imputation of judging too hastily and partially. He feared that their assumed proclivity for drink would lead to drunkenness and unsoldier-like conduct. Records reveal, however, that Brock's concerns, at least in this circumstance, were completely unwarranted. The 100th Regiment were repeatedly praised for their good behavior, both before and during the war, specifically for demonstrating, and I quote, honest and soldier-like conduct. They earned a battle honor for their tireless defense on the Niagara frontier in the latter half of the war, and so did the 49th for their gallantry at Queenston Heights on October 13th, 1812. So these perceptions didn't always match up with reality when we're talking about Irish regiments. Now, Brock's comments about the various temptations by which they're surrounded further reveals that service in the Canadas, like the other colonies, also carried some serious assumptions about liquor. Military physicians, such as the aforementioned Thomas Trotter, theorized that drunkenness prevails more in cold climates than in warm, and Upper Canada was certainly recognized as a cold climate. Furthermore, metropolitan observers saw colonial society in general as rife with this cheap liquor and populated by people of a questionable moral character. Drunkenness was basically thought to be inevitable under these conditions. The Scottish gentleman John Howison, who traveled to Upper Canada shortly after the war, complained that all sorts of people are detestable when under the influence of ardent spirits, but the Americans particularly so. By Americans, he means North Americans. The influence of liquor only serves to draw forth their natural coarseness, insolence, and rankness of feeling, and to make them, as it were, caricatures of themselves. Whoever wishes to attain a just conception of the enormity which the human character assumes when unchecked by restraint, unrefined by education, and unmodeled by dependence, should spend an hour in the barroom of some low tavern in Upper Canada when a party of common farmers are drinking together. This is a picture of a Dutch tavern, but I quite like this image. So basically, Howison felt that North American colonials were more prone to problematic drunkenness than their social betters in the metropole, basically because of their inherent brutishness, lack of civility, education, restraint, and dependent socioeconomic position, which he all listed there above. These characteristics were constructed as defining members of the social elite from the lower orders. If the elite were civilized, the lower orders were savage. There was always the binary juxtaposition. This would also separate colonial gentlemen from gentlemen from the metropole, John Howison being a gentleman from the metropole. So even people in Upper Canada who were considered gentlemen would have still been looked down upon by him on his travels. But basically, these assumptions about drinking colonial society only compounded officers' fears that these lower class Irish soldiers would soon become drunk when stationed in the Canadas. Speaking of the 41st Regiment, Brock expressed concern that it was so dispersed across the country and surrounded by evils like cheap liquor, that despite the zeal and intelligence of the commanding officers, the discipline and morals of the men would sooner or later be compromised. He was confident, however, that the older, more experienced men of the 41st, who were a predominantly English regiment, could be better trusted to resist these evils, like intemperance, than those wild Irishmen of the 49th. So this highlights yet another factor which contributed to the idea that the soldiers in Canada were particularly prone to drink. Now, a final thing to consider is youth. And I really love this picture. Some of the youngest and most inexperienced troops in the British Army were sent to serve in the Canadas. This included regiments which had just recently been formed, such as the 100th Regiment, which we mentioned, and especially the 103rd Regiment. More experienced and hardened troops are typically going to be reserved for service in Europe against the armies of Napoleon. In fact, William Tiger Dunlop, who I mentioned before, he complained that one of the great drawbacks of the service in Canada was that we got the rubbish of every department in the army. Any man whom the Dukes deemed unfit for the peninsula was considered as quite good enough for the Canadian market. So speaking of the recruits landing at Quebec, we find many notations that they're mere boys, or other characterizations that they're quite young from officers. And again, this is particularly true of the 103rd Regiment, who has a reputation as possibly one of the youngest regiments ever fielded in British service. Their youth reinforced notions that the men were adolescent bachelors, were childlike, and unable to regulate their impulses. Unfortunately, this number of young, inexperienced soldiers, the problem with this was further compounded by the fact that there were very few experienced officers available to lead them. Brock frequently remarked upon the lack of quality officers available in the Canadas. Speaking of the 41st, he complained to his brother Savory that it was an uncommonly fine regiment, but wretchedly officered. Brock similarly noted that the 49th had 5 captains in England and 2 on staff in the country, which leaves it bare of experienced officers. This was also the case with the young 103rd. Their commanding officer, Hercules Scott, was also frequently away on staff duties. Basically, any officer with experience in the Canadas was recruited for administrative staff duties, and therefore the people in the field were all very, very young and inexperienced. Regimental course-martial records for the 103rd actually show that they experienced numerous problems too, along with their youth. They were renowned for problems with theft, insubordination, and also drunkenness. But it's interesting to note when studying instances of drunkenness among soldiers in the courts-martial cases, that very few cases involving drunken soldiers really ever make it above the regimental level. There's 3 levels, regimental being the lowest, because officers held that they alone possess the ability of restraint. So it fell to them alone to regulate the drinking of the men under their command. It was assumed that the men couldn't help themselves. With regards to the 103rd, their most disgraceful conduct, which has sullied the soldier's character, that was from a court-martial, was actually blamed on the failure of officers to properly inculcate a good system of interior discipline. So in that case, the privates were let off, and the officer took the blame for their drunkenness. In another instance involving the Canadian Fencible Regiment, their commanding officer, Captain McQueen, he was similarly chastised for failing to exert his authority to prevent the improper use of liquor in the guardroom, rather than blaming the soldiers who got drunk. Basically, military officials generally held that, and I took this right out of a legal case, where regularity and good order prevail among officers, especially among the captains of troops and companies, who are the main springs of discipline, the private soldier is seldom guilty of insubordination and misbehavior. So again, this ties back to what I was talking about with different perceptions of addiction and drunkenness and inebriety. It's thought that these soldiers, because of their race, because of their social standing, because of where they're located, that is what is leading them to drink, and that their officers are so socially superior, so civilized, that they alone have the skill in inebriation to resist. Which leads me to talk a little bit about officers. We've got Wellington on the left there and Isaac Brock on the right. British officers in this period constructed their identity in direct relation to them, the men under their command. And this is first and foremost a class distinction. Army officers in this period were judged for a lot more than their skill on the battlefield. They're basically expected to be upper class gentlemen even during war. This is typically denoted by things such as refined manners. You have to show off your skill in dancing. You have to have a great capacity for polite social performance and conversing with the ladies. So officers of this period, less than being a hardcore martial figure in the way that we sometimes think about it today, was very much a gentleman and an officer, with the gentleman part coming first. Now, to be thought of a gentleman in British society in the 18th century, a man typically needed sufficient land holdings, wealth, or aristocratic family ties. Gentlemanliness typically denotes high birth or gentility. The officer corps of the era was primarily drawn from this gentlemanly group. These men were typically members of the aristocracy, or a little bit lower, the nobility, and often the gentry. For example, both Isaac Brock and John Le Couture both came from prominent Channel Islands families with serious royal connections. This class dynamic was largely maintained by the commission system, which I mentioned earlier. The British military in this period, an officer's rank or his commission, it's typically purchased rather than earned, and it's treated very much like a commodity. A promotion could be obtained by other means, through patronage or by seniority. The Duke of Wellington on the left there actually gains some ranks because he proves himself quite capable in battle. But prior to the war, in the 18th century especially, the most common method was purchase. This fades by the end of the 19th century, really in a transition period in 1812. But prior to this, it's all by purchase. And the high price of these commissions, with the entry-level rank of ensign costing roughly £450 at the time, and a captaincy costing £1,500 at the time. I had the translation into modern money, but I can't seem to find it here. Quite a bit. Effectively restricted access to these positions to meta means. You have to be able to afford this. Officers also, once you're commissioned, I should say, they're additionally expected to pay for all of their own expenses. You have to purchase your own attire, these fancy uniforms these gentlemen are wearing. You have to purchase your own rations, your own equipment. You have to purchase a horse, lodging. You have to keep up a certain lifestyle. So although these positions actually paid relatively well, it was rarely enough to cover most officers' expenses. So the holding of an officer's commission alone denotes a certain level of wealth and financial independence, which at this time is a defining quality of manhood, financial independence. And in doing so, just simply holding a commission sort of confers this gentlemanly status in civilian life. Now, as you may have guessed, the commission system and the rank system in the Army was very complex and highly regulated. It was ultimately meant to recreate and reinforce the civilian social hierarchy within the military sphere, with these gentleman officers situated firmly at the top. Each rank above ensign increased in price, and these could be purchased up to lieutenant colonel. Men typically had to wait a number of years, however, before they're eligible to purchase a higher rank. Le Couture was eager to attain the rank of captain, which took a minimum of 3 years to attain. But most men had to wait much longer because the opportunity to purchase a new rank was granted by seniority. Now, interesting enough, officers seeking to switch regiments, typically this was done in pursuit of either a more prestigious or less dangerous posting. They could sell out of one regiment and buy into another if they want. So again, this is treated very much like a commodity. When an officer retired, he could sell that commission, providing a nice little retirement fund, or he could go on to half pay. Couldn't do this during wartime, though. If an officer's regiment was disbanded or made inactive, he would typically be put on half pay or given an opportunity to purchase a commission in another regiment. Now, during the War of 1812, I know I've already used this picture, but I loved it, so I'm using it again. The commission system was largely bypassed. As I mentioned, this is a bit of a transition period, and during the war, you see the commission system sort of go out the window. As Lieutenant Le Couture noted, in those days of raging wars, all sorts of men obtained commissions, some without education, some without means, some without either, and many of low birth. So the size of the British Army, as I mentioned, had increased exponentially, really, in this period to wage war against Napoleon. So this necessitates more officers. As the war drags on, fresh replacements of those officers are also needed. And very quickly, the demand for officers quickly surpasses the available supply of proper gentlemen. So men of lower birth and lesser means, who typically had to wait lifetimes for promotion, could quickly advance through the ranks. By 1810, we have record that as many as 4/5 of all commissions were obtained by means other than purchase. By the end of the war, only 2 in every 10 promotions in the Army was by purchase. So this system was very much fading. No longer was the officer corps dominated by men who were from the aristocracy and gentry, who had been appointed to this position based on family name or social connections. So it's really changing in this period. And this is a slide I had a little bit of trouble with, compatibility issue, but there we've got the 3 guys there. These are some officers who fought in the War of 1812, some guys who I've read quite a bit of their works. You may recognize some of them. They're in large part not these aristocratic gentlemen from the previous era. Isaac Brock certainly was, but guys like William Tiger Dunlop on the left, or William Tiger Dunlop on the left, he's a 3rd son of a Scottish banker. You've got William Hamilton Merritt in the middle. He served as a captain in the Niagara Light Dragoons during the war. He was the son of a former Army officer who had settled in Upper Canada. And Major John Richardson on the right there, who volunteered during the war in the 41st Regiment and goes on to be an author after the war. Some of you may be familiar. He's also born to a former Army surgeon. So these people aren't coming necessarily from these high aristocratic backgrounds. A bunch of these men did actually receive formal education, but they just didn't have that high birth. They were expected to still act like gentlemen, however, And one aspect of this gentlemanly performance was certainly drinking. Fine wines in particular, drinking fine wines. These were a staple of distinction in any officer's mess. The Light Dragoons mess rules, I've pulled some mess rules. A mess is basically just a place where the officers go to drink together and to eat together. But I've pulled some different mess rules which really show behind the scenes at what's happening at these events. And one mess rules for the Light Dragoons decree that port wine and sherry wine in particular were the only wines permitted to be served in the mess. So it's all about high quality wine for these gentlemen. The consumption of expensive high quality wines is to denote wealth and genteel status. And in the Army, officers are certainly the only ones who can afford to purchase wine and drink it with any sort of regularity. They're also the only ones who are permitted to do so. So by procuring the highest quality wines, they could conspicuously demonstrate their superior gentlemanly style. I've got great quotes from officers during the war. Le Couture boasts that his officers' mess featured wines as old as in a private cellar. Dunlop similarly lauds praise on one regiment who he dined with, both of gentlemen from Montreal, for their conspicuous consumption. And I quote, "I think these were in a perfect state of drill, and in their handsome new uniforms had a most imposing appearance. But if their discipline was commendable, their commissariat was beyond all praise. Long lines of carts were seen to be bearing in casks and hampers of the choicest wines, to say nothing of the venison, turkeys, hams, and all other esculents necessary to recruit their strength under the fatigues of war. There can be little doubt that a gourmand would greatly prefer the comfort of dining with a mess of privates of those of this distinguished corps, to the honor and glory of being half starved, of which he ran no small risk, at the table of the Governor General himself." So the officers in this regiment had very firmly established their gentlemanly identity in the eyes of their peers. They're held up as perhaps even more gentlemanly than the Governor General himself. Now, the most popular of the wines drank by officers in this period, I've studied a lot about what these guys were drinking. If you want a good book on wine, there's one by Charles Luddington called "The Politics of Wine in Britain." And we find that they really liked port wine. At the time of his death in 1812, Major General Isaac Brock owned 566 individual bottles of port, which comprised the vast majority of his wine collection. For those who aren't familiar, I certainly wasn't about 6 years ago when I started researching this. Port's a fortified wine, similar to Madeira or sherry, but it's produced historically in the Douro region of Portugal. Yeah, I could speak a lot more about port, but for another day. For example, this is very expensive, though, at the time. Those bottles owned by Sir Isaac Brock cost approximately 4 shillings per bottle. That's roughly a week's wage for an enlisted soldier for one bottle. But it's also really popular, not just because it's expensive and fancy. There's another really interesting reason, and this is what ties into discussions of masculinity. There's a great quote from Dr. Samuel Johnson, who's the inveterate 18th century gentleman. He felt that port was the strongest and manliest of the wines, and I'll quote. "Johnson harangued upon the qualities of different liquors and spoke with great contempt of claret, as so weak that a man would be drowned by it before it made him drunk." That's a French wine. He was persuaded to drink 1 glass of it, that he might judge, not from recollection, which might be dim, but from immediate sensation. He shook his head and said, "Poor stuff! No, sir, claret is the liquor for boys, port for men. But he who aspires to be a hero," smiling, "must drink brandy. There are indeed few who are able to drink brandy." So This is not just a commentary on alcohol percentage. Different wines also had different national associations. So you can see I'm haranguing upon the qualities of the French wine, given that they are currently at war with the French, and very much enjoying the Portuguese wine, the Portuguese being military allies of the British against the French. So there's national considerations here. But there's also, again, the alcohol percentage. Consuming weak French claret, which is about 14% alcohol in this context, would threaten to make the imbiber similarly weak. Whereas drinking fortified port wine, on the other hand, which is roughly 20% alcohol, and again was produced by Britain's ally Portugal, demonstrated manly strength. Now, the final comment suggests that consuming the fortifying agent itself, brandy, which was roughly 40% alcohol, was manlier still. Thus, being able to consume large amounts of port or brandy very much demonstrated not only refinement and privilege in this period, but manly strength. When gentlemen officers drank port and brandy together, quantity of consumption was also important, and for two reasons. And now, first, the ability to consume in large quantities further denotes wealth and status, particularly in periods of wartime scarcity. Charles James noted that in the Horse Guards, for example, they're the most prestigious and aristocratic unit of the army. They drank Madeira, port, and claret without limitation. In the 41st mess, those men were entitled to a 2-pint of wine allowance before even being charged for further service. That was basically a minimum drink order was 2 pints of wine, probably port wine. Even a contemporary civilian recognized that in this period in the Canadas, there was a good deal of drinking among the officers. So they're drinking even quite heavily for the time period, and certainly a good deal more than the enlisted men who they're calling drunken. Now, the ability to consume large amounts of wine, particularly strong white wine such as port, it further demonstrates masculine strength in these settings. The strongest and manliest of the group basically is he who can drink the most. Tolerance comes into play. He who can drink the most without becoming overly intoxicated. Dr. Johnson, for example, he boasts that he could drink 3 bottles of port in one sitting without being the worse for it. And Dr. John Campbell, a frequent attendee at Johnson's Literary Club, bragged that he once drank 13 bottles of port in a sitting. I don't know about you, but I'm quite sick after one. Now, these men very much wore their ability to consume heavily and to barely intoxicating effects as a badge of honor, as a badge of manliness. Weaker men were marked by their calls for water, by leaving to go to bed early, or by vomiting and having to be collected off the floor. Or worse yet, those men who abstained from drink altogether. They were seen as similarly weak and effeminate, and typically ostracized from the group. So in this way, quantity of consumption, in addition to quality, very much established a hierarchy of manliness and set these guys up as these gentlemanly figures. Now we're going to transition into the post-war period here. We see some significant changes to definitions of martial masculinity in the post-war. There you see them signing the Treaty of Ghent, if you're not familiar with the painting. The gentleman officer tradition did continue after the war. Officers are still largely drawn from the upper classes, and gentlemanliness still means high birth, breeding, education. One historian notes that members of the gentry and aristocracy continue to make up the bulk of the officer corps because they had greater access to formal military educations, which really become a prime requisite in the post-war as the Army is rapidly professionalizing. But in the post-war, how or rather whether a man earned his commission actually gains increased importance. Officers who purchased or were appointed their rank based on patronage, sycophants, and especially those men who held their commission like a conspicuous commodity, they're increasingly seen as effeminate, as poor warriors. Now, this is, of course, is mostly what officers do in peacetime, is gaining promotions through other means, because you can't gain a promotion through achieving glorious victories on the battlefield. But veterans of the war speak of these new military men with contempt. Men whose, and I quote, whose chief object was not to seek laurels for themselves, but to compliment each other on the gallant deeds performed by their regiments long before they were born, or at least out of leading strings, and to assume a credit for those deeds to themselves. So veterans such as Dunlop were not a big fan of post-war Army men. What constituted appropriate gentlemanly behavior also changed considerably in the post-war period. Gentlemen in the post-war period were increasingly judged for their restraint, their hard work, their morality, and their capacity for polite social performance. So overindulgence in leisure and luxury, including the conspicuous consumption of alcohol, becomes increasingly seen as effeminate rather than manly. Drunkenness, even amongst all male peer groups, it's increasingly seen as brutish and uncivilized by Victorian standards. This is no longer a desirable behavior. Charles Ludington, who I mentioned, he notes in his history that the post-Napoleonic period saw a significant decline in wine consumption and excessive intoxication amongst the upper classes in Britain. Comments from Richardson suggest that heavy wine consumption also became less effective in establishing the manhood of gentlemen officers. Excuse me. He noted, and this is one great quote from his post-war writings: "When I first entered the army upwards of 25 years ago, the soldier was looked upon as a hardy veteran, and not in the manner in which he is now regarded. There was the same attention to his comfort, but not to his luxurious ease. There was the same esprit de corps, but it was one of generous emulation in the field. There was never such a thing dreamt of as soldiers of one regiment giving a sumptuous and distinguished entertainment to the soldiers of another, and drinking over fine wines of the choicest kind, followed by the farce of the publicity of their festive entertainment, their misplaced orgies in the daily papers, as if the public could be expected to feel the slightest interest in their high life below stairs bacchanalian proceedings." So that's quite a bit. Richardson basically frames he frames all these post-war efforts to improve the situation of the soldier as, attention paid to luxurious ease. It's just rendering these new men weak or less hardy than men of his era. These men are made further effeminate in his characterization by their scandalous lifestyles of leisure and luxury, including all of the off-hour socializing with their peers and this conspicuous consumption of wine. His comment, "High life below stairs," in case anybody's not familiar, is a reference to the popular 1819 Cruikshank satirical print, which I have up there, which depicts the Prince Regent and his private secretary, General Benjamin Bloomfield. Oh, sorry, I put the wrong one up there. I switched at the last second. Basically, the idea with high life below stairs is the lower orders are acting as members of the upper orders in a mocking way. We can see here it's the former servants and cooks and maids have all come and put on the elegant trappings of wealth and are getting stupidly drunk on port as their supposed social betters.
Jesse, are we supposed to be seeing pictures?
Are you not able to see anything at the moment?
No.
Is anybody else having that issue? Can they not see the slides?
No slides here.
No pictures. I haven't had
The screen is black.
It's been black for a long time.
Yes, it has. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
Now they're coming up.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened there. I apologize. I guess I will continue on. Perhaps it automatically timed out. I don't know which one you last saw, but oh well, we push on. Let me just find my place here. So basically, the writings of Richardson really depict this post-war period as a period where gentlemen stopped drinking, but we do have writings from other veteran officers, such as Dunlop, which present a very different picture of officers' post-war drinking and socializing habits. They suggest that former gentleman officers, now gentlemen settlers in Canada, still very much drank like gentlemen of the previous era. Conspicuously consuming their port and claret wines. We have, for example, one note from Captain Langslow in 1817 that he says he dined with the mess of the 70th Regiment, port and claret in profusion. They live well and have a good mess. Even as late as the 1830s and 40s, which at that point you're in the real throes of temperance, Dunlop recalls a visit to Kingston in which he had the pleasure of dining with the agreeable family of the town major Fitzgerald, an old soldier who had seen much service and who well knew how to exercise the hospitality of Auld Lang Syne. Dearly and with the ineffable gusto of a connoisseur, he did love his glass of port wine, and nothing disconcerted him so much as to see his guest commit the sin of neglecting to put the stopper in the decanter when the wine remained with him. So still very much into this proper, elevated, civilized means of consuming large quantities of wine. Other veterans like Richardson may have come to regard this behavior as scandalous and effeminate at this point, but there's still clearly some gentlemen officers who had not changed with the times. In fact, Dunlop even goes so far as to see new military men as less manly than wartime veterans, precisely because they're starting to become more temperate in their drinking habits. His recollection, contrary to Richardson's, was that men of the area, true warriors, they very much drank hard, and this is largely what defined them as martial men. He recalled that he and his fellow messmates, who again he described as a fine, jovial, unsophisticated set of wild, tremendous Irishmen. Here's how he described their time together. We rarely went.
We can't see the photo again. Sorry to interrupt, but there we go. Yeah.
No problem. I guess that's a bit of a timeout feature. My mistake.
Yeah. But
I'll
we
make
can
sure
see
to
now.
I'll keep clicking. I'll keep clicking. They really went to bed without the respectable quorum getting a little to the lee side of sobriety. Temperatur morimatur, says Horace, but I very much doubt if nos, that is, such as we are alive of nos. He's doing a Latin reference here, which I'll explain in a moment. But basically, the army is very different from what it was in my day. Sadly changed indeed. It will hardly be believed, but I have dined with officers who, after drinking a few glasses of wine, called for their coffee. If Waterloo was to fight over again, no rational man can suppose that we would gain it after symptoms of such degeneracy. Such ladylike gentlemen would certainly take out vinaigrettes and scream at a charge of the old guard, and be horrified at the sight of a set of grim-looking Frenchmen, all grin and gash, whisker and moustache. So times had indeed changed by the 1840s. In the wake of increased professionalization, sweeping army reforms, and the rise of temperance. But Dunlop argued that the surviving veterans of the war, that's what he meant by those of us so are alive, such as Nos, had very much not changed with the times. For them, hard drinking, social drinking, successful drinking continued to be the barometer of martial manliness. Real officers, real soldiers, real men, they drank heavily and they bore the effects well. This new generation of military men, in Dunlop's view, were made effeminate and poor warriors by their temperate habits. His comments basically highlight that while both the army and concepts of martial masculinity had undergone considerable change in the post-war period, many veterans resisted that change and continued to evoke their own wartime brand of martial masculinity. Times of war had demanded a more unified ideal, but times of peace clearly permitted the existence of multiple ideas of what it meant to be a man. And that is about it for me. I will happily take questions. And sorry again about the timeout issues. I will happily go back if you want to see any slides we missed.
Hi, Jesse. It's David Camilletti. We have some questions from the audience. I'm going to go through them, and if anyone else wants to jump in at the end, feel free to do so. Our our speaker for our next session, Cameron Shelley, asked two questions. First of all, have you seen the BBC series Sharp?
I am familiar with the series. I haven't seen it in full, but it's been recommended to me a number of times, including by my father, who's quite a big fan of it.
Okay. The second question is from Cameron. How did the soldiers view the drinking habits of their superiors? Is there any information on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are very few accounts from soldiers on anything, on the war in general, on anything that they experienced. You do get more from this period of just common soldiers writing coming out of the Peninsular War, but coming out of the War of 1812, which is what I tried to focus on, there's literally one account from an enlisted soldier. It's Shadrach Byfield, and unfortunately, he really doesn't talk much about officers drinking. So that's something I couldn't find a whole lot about.
Okay. From Alex Smith, is our military still blighted by a culture based on these characteristics? And then an observation, I find the officers' mess a very pleasant place to spend time, but I must admit it's a guilty pleasure. Drinking, masculinity, and entitlement are very much a feature of our military, and is it something that afflicts our military today?
Yeah, I haven't actually experienced any military service. I have been invited to a couple dinners in an officer's mess before, the Queen's York Rangers, and I'd say there's certainly still a very distinct class-based culture where the officers are still very separate from the enlisted men and thought of in very different regards. I'm hesitant to say that alcoholism is still a large problem in the military, because I'm hesitant to say that it was a problem in the military at that period either. I think it's all about how you conceptualize it. It's certainly still a popular conception. There is certainly still a popular understanding that soldiers are prone to drink.
Do you know if the same condition, this is from Ken Irvin, do you know, I'm sorry, from Cameron again, sorry, were the same views present in the French and American armies of the period?
Yes, certainly. The American armies of the period paralleled a lot of these views, and you can read some physicians like James Mann that very much parallel the works of Thomas Trotter and a lot of these British guys. So I'd say with the American army, most certainly. And then, sorry, you asked about which other army?
The French army.
The French. Most of my sources I read are British, English, that sort of thing. So they have a very dim view of the French. If you went by those sources, they would say that drinking is a massive problem in the French army. They frequently quote saying, these terrible Frenchmen have no morals. They would strip a body in the middle of battle for money for drink. But then again, they say the same things about their own men. So
this one from Ken Irvin, who's on our board. Have you tried to compare the consumption of the officers and the enlisted men? Yes.
As best I can tell, enlisted men are not receiving they don't have access to alcohol much outside of their regular daily ration, which is about a gill of spirits. That's about 4 ounces. And actually, I found in my studies that for the most part during the War of 1812, they were so hard up for grain, for spirits, and for supplies. Most guys didn't get their daily ration for most of the war. So most soldiers were drinking next to nothing during the war, whereas most officers they can afford to import. They're constantly importing bottles of wine, bottles of port. Like I said, we do have access to a list of what was in Brock's estate after he died. And the one thing is a massive wine collection.
Wow. Coming from Ron Haddle, Jesse, you've referenced William Tiger Dunlop. I've not heard you mention that he, along with John Galt, were the founders of Guelph and Goderich, as they were the land agents for the Canada Company.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I love talking about Tiger Dunlop, is I hope people are already familiar with him. Maybe you live in Barrie and you're off Dunlop Street or something, but he certainly plays a very prominent role in Upper Canadian history after his time in the military. And he very quickly gets out of the military after the War of 1812. He did not enjoy his time in the military, and most of it he didn't even spend in battle, and he still hated it. So he goes on to a very interesting career. He's a great figure to research afterwards. He gets the nickname Tiger because he goes to India as a journalist, and he takes to a popular British pastime of throwing snuff in the face of tigers to distract them while you shoot them.
Good stuff. From Rob Morris, is there any relationship between stress from drinking and fatigue for those who fought on the battlefield?
Yeah, they actually thought that it helped with stress, but in a whole different way. There's an idea in this period that you really take upon the qualities of what you're drinking, and I won't get too much into it, but the bottom line is that they do think that alcohol has the power to sort of embolden the body, strengthen the body, fortify your constitution, so it can really help to deal with some of these stresses and these problems afflicted during war. I'm trying to think who wrote it. One of the officers I study, he talks about during this hellish period, this siege, they're under attack. He runs away, he escapes in a ditch, he passes out, and when he wakes up, he finds that there's a store of port wine nearby, and he just chugs a bottle, the whole thing. And he talks about it's the most wonderful moment of repose I've ever experienced in my lifetime. So yeah, they very much used alcohol on the battlefield for that.
Okay, again from Ken Irvin, as part of your research, did you try and consume the same amount of alcohol as the officers at the time?
So yes, I was very unfamiliar with what port wine was when I began, and I mentioned this to a wine group that I was in when I was down at Brock in Niagara. Everything's wine. So they hooked me up with some port and they let me try it, and we drank quite a bit, and it will get you drunk very quickly. I would not be able to compete with these so-called 3-bottle men, because that stuff's strong.
Good stuff. Those are our written questions. Does anyone in the audience of our viewers have any questions for Jesse directly? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. It must have been because I don't have my computer plugged in. It was doing some sort of timeout there. So glad somebody mentioned something, though. At least we got most of them in.
Oh,
Yeah, it wasn't for the whole thing, Jesse. Don't worry. It was later in the presentation and we caught it. Thanks.
Perfect.
Jesse, is your work going to be? Do you have any ambitions to publish it once you're done, or?
Yeah, I do. That is the plan. Right now, I have drafts of everything submitted for the dissertation, so it's just a matter of sort of finalizing and defending, and then later this year, I guess I'll look on to publishing. So that it certainly won't be for a couple of years if this does come out.
Okay, excellent. We're getting a number of comments from members of the audience how much they've enjoyed your presentation. Again, is there any other comments from any other questions? Or I think I might have missed one here. Oh, Cameron Shelley again. He wants to know, what will you drink when you graduate?
I have a very special bottle of wine set aside that my parents brought back from Italy for me. It's been sitting, I think 6 or 7 years in my basement, and I'm just waiting to drink that one.
Okay, one quick question. Was there any difference among the English, the Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh that you noticed in your research?
Yeah, they all thought each other were drunks. Basically, if you're reading an English physician, he calls the Scottish drunks, and if you're reading a Scottish physician, he calls the Irish drunks, and if you're reading an Irish physician, he calls the English drunks, and they sort of go around and around in a circle. The Welsh in this period sort of just get rolled into English, though, even if you look up official military records of what the composition is of each regiment, how much Welsh, how much English, Scottish, yada yada. Welsh are just considered English, so not much national distinction there.
Okay, good stuff. I'm going to turn it over to Betty Lou to thank you. I just want to remind anyone who's not renewed their membership that you can go on our website and do so if you prefer to do that over mailing in your check. And our next speaker, one of our viewers tonight, he'll be here on, I believe it's on April the 5th. Cameron Shelley will be talking about his series on wealth history and postcards. Betty Lou, could we turn it over to you to thank our speaker?
Thanks, David. I didn't realize there was so much snobbery in the military. And you wonder, how clear-headed were these people when they went into war? Did they drink and then go into war?
Yeah, there's a practice called Dutch courage, in which the officers would actually give a dram or a shot of liquor out to each of the men in line before entering battle. Part of being a soldier in this period is less about being efficient and being quick and being, it's stand in a line, present when told to, and fire when told to, and you're probably going to get shot. So they didn't worry too much about how level-headed the men were, but the officers themselves, of course, they just figure, I've got the requisite skill in inebriation. This doesn't affect me. So I imagine there were some issues.
Thank you so much for the evening. We really enjoyed it. And we do want to thank the presentation and the way you did it, but also next month, we'll find a lot of very interesting local information when our guest speaker comes. So don't miss April's meeting either. Thanks a lot. Great, Jesse.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank everyone for coming.